When I was young, Adventure Island 2 was one of my favorite games. I loved how cute it was, I especially loved the dinosaurs, and the music in that game still hits a nostalgia chord with me like very few other NES games do. I never owned the first Adventure Island growing up, but I had very vague memories of playing it at a friend's house, so as soon as I got a credit card, I bought it. I had high hopes of experiencing more of what I loved about Adventure Island 2, but I ended up being pretty disappointed instead. The first Adventure Island was a huge step backwards and felt really bare bones with a lot of what I loved about the second game stripped away. It found its way into a drawer and stayed there on a relatively permanent basis. I spent many years wanting more of everything that made Adventure Island 2 feel so good to me, and one day I discovered that there were two other games in the series for NES and Famicom. There was Adventure Island 3, which continued the platforming legacy of the games that came before it, and Adventure Island 4, which was a Japan-exclusive game that turned a lot of the Adventure Island conventions upside down. Although platforming is still at the heart of Adventure Island 4's gameplay, there are many innovations that make it feel like a brand new experience. It abandons the level-centric design from the former games and presents you with an open world that slowly opens up as you find new items and tools throughout the journey. For the first time, falling into a pit doesn't kill you, but instead drops you into a new area to explore. The hub point of this world is the home that's shared between Master Higgins and Tina, where you'll be able to save your game and also start from when you enter a password. The dynamic between them is one of my favorite parts about the game. Seeing Tina wave goodbye every time I set back out on my adventure melted my heart. I appreciate that the game also gave me the ability to bow down and worship my beautiful wife, and that was something I tried to do as much as possible. Apart from moving to an open world format, one of the most impactful changes is the incorporation of a health meter to replace one-hit deaths. Master Higgins is still eating for a small army, but here eating 8 fruits restores 1 heart on the life bar instead of buying more time on the former energy bar. Although items can still be found in eggs along the way, these are now whole or partial hearts to elongate your health meter, or sticks of meat that completely refill health instead of the axes and skateboards of old. These eggs can be found off the beaten path and may take some work to get to, but the reward of a longer life meter makes the extra wandering worth it with the shift in gameplay style. One-hit deaths are now a distant, horrible memory, and the change to a life bar took so much of the pressure off for me. The earlier Adventure Island games felt like they were designed for speedrunning, but as much as I love charging through levels at breakneck speed in those games, I welcome the opportunity to slow down and take in the sights and sound of this world for the very first time without the dread of a timer ticking away. There's a great degree of emphasis on exploration to not only find a path forward, but to also pick up the tools required to open up blocked paths. Major items required for the quest, like weapons or tools, are usually dropped following a boss encounter, but I'll talk more about those fights later on. Some of the tools you find help you to break down physical obstructions or help your character to maneuver through platforming setbacks more easily. Weapons differ in strength and range, and some are multifunctional and can also act as tools, like the bubble gun, for example. As you might expect in a game with a large inventory, some of the items only see the light of day once or twice throughout the entire game. Of all the items, the ones that I stayed away from most were the surf, skate, or snowboards. Although Master Higgins was considerably more adorable than usual while riding these, weapons were not able to be used simultaneously. This is different from the earlier NES Adventure Islands, where riding the skateboard and throwing as many axes as possible while avoiding impending doom was the norm. With the limitations on weapon use imposed in Adventure Island 4, I never used any of those travel aids unless I absolutely had to for puzzle solving. There was never any reason I'd want to be moving that fast through an onslaught of enemies with no way to defend myself. Getting new items was also a requirement for participating in a bunch of different minigames. Popping enough balloons with the spear or smashing enough moles on the head with the hammer would reward you with a key that could be shown to some other animal gatekeeper and get you into new areas. These competitions were a bit frustrating at first because I wasn't entirely clear on how things worked. It turns out that the more fruits you have in your fruit meter, the better you're able to perform. If this was mentioned somewhere in the instructions, I wasn't able to find an English copy of them anywhere. Grinding to fill up that fruit meter to 7 out of 8 was the perfect way to guarantee a win as long as you weren't asleep at the controller. Once the main item was won, you could always go back and play again for other useful items. The different areas of the game were extremely well designed, with all of the usual suspects present. You had your deserts, caves, volcanoes, and ice-covered sections, to name a few. None were so big that you'd be lost and wandering around without knowing where to go or what to do next, but problem solving with the tools and weapons that you collected made the work to push forward feel deserved and meaningful. Noticing a dehydrated sprout or seeing a screen of sky I couldn't reach yet really got the wheels in my head turning. I made many mental notes on where to return to when I found an item that might help me get there. Problem solving was really instinctive, and the way that items and mechanics from one area built on the next made figuring stuff out feel really fluid and satisfying. It introduced a sense of freedom, but had the gentle confines of linearity as well, forcing you to complete certain tasks before you could move on to the next, but giving you enough incentive to take a good look around too. Platforming felt as good as you can expect from an Adventure Island game, and using each of the items that enhanced travel or jumping had a distinct feel and were very quick to adapt to for the most part. One aspect I found hard to get a feel for altogether was swimming. Gaining any momentum underwater took forever, but once you had it, Master Higgins became very hard to control. This was one part of the game where I ran into all sorts of trouble trying to avoid enemies, since they were often much faster than my ability to react. The only other awkward bit of character control came from changing screens vertically. This was often done by hopping on springy sprouts, but as you were launched into the screen above you, you'd have no idea where you'd land. With enemies respawning every time you go to a new screen, this could have easily become a recipe for disaster at certain points in the game, but it was by no means insurmountable. Along with fighting enemies, new and old while traveling, there were also two kinds of boss fights to get through. The first are different mini-bosses that drop a new item or weapon after they're defeated. These fights ranged from pitifully easy to quite difficult, and sometimes required strategizing by exploiting the environment you're fighting in. The other big fights were against what I'd consider to be major bosses. Winning a major boss fight also rewarded you with a new item, but would also free one of your dinosaur friends from captivity, which is the driving plot of the main story. These fights were an exercise in endurance that required some watching and learning versus running and swinging. They were considerably more fast-paced than anything I'd encountered in previous games in the series, but once you got the pattern down, the bosses were pretty quick to fall. I find Adventure Island 4 did a much better job than the others at building up suspense before a major boss fight by playing some foreboding music in the screens leading up to the encounter, sometimes right alongside a change in scenery to something a little drabber. There was always a place to grind fruits and refill the life meter too, something that I found myself taking advantage of often. Getting to the boss was sometimes harder than the boss itself. A disappointing aspect of this game was how little the dinosaurs were used. They were my absolute favorite part of Adventure Island 2, and finding them in the wild and being able to take them along when I needed them was really special to me in that game. Here, they felt like more of an afterthought. Of the 5 possible dinos, only one of them was required to make progress, with the others being completely optional. I would have loved to have seen them integrated into some of the puzzle solving, or at least be able to be called to an area if you needed them, rather than having them holed up in a house in the area near the Higgins residence. I very rarely went back there to bring one of them along, because by the time I realized I needed them, I was already so far away that it would have been more work to go back for them than it would have been to go on without them. One thing I appreciated that was different from previous games was that when you did have a dinosaur along, you could put them away into your inventory if things got too hairy and there was a risk of losing them. This was really useful in the cloud area, where enemies move much faster than you and your pteranodon friend. Being able to save my dinos from becoming a puff of smoke was a nice change that helped me to sleep better at night. In the interest of not spoiling the last stretch of the game, all I'll say is that it did a lovely job of ramping up the story and bringing everything you've learned together in the final area. Although the last section wasn't the most difficult part of the game to maneuver through, I'm looking at you, Pyramid. It was a great final test that got me to apply everything that I knew and still surprised me around every corner. It was a nail-biting end to a truly fantastic game. Adventure Island 4 successfully transformed one of my favorite video game series into something even better than I ever could have dreamed of as a kid. With such a late release in the Famicom's lifespan though, it sadly never made it overseas. This is a huge letdown given how good this game is, and it really makes me wonder if an international release might have influenced the direction of the games that followed it. I would have personally loved more of what this game brought to the table, and I suppose there's a bit of that in Super Adventure Island 2 to be had. Adventure Island 4 is by no means a brand new, never-before-seen experience on the NES, but it does take many elements of a good adventure game and presents them with a light-hearted but demanding quest that forces you to think before you act and rewards you for choosing well. It's not too often that you get to take familiar characters for a spin and experience them in an entirely different way.